presents Hollywood.
American audiences have always loved flag-waving war movies. They cheered when U.S. forces ran up San Juan Hill in the late 1800s, tearing down the Spanish flag, whistling when Charlie Chaplin single-handedly captured the Kaiser in Shoulder Arms. Don't forget, when it comes to war movies, many are a representation of history. It's somehow connected to a real event of the past, whether it's recent or all the way back to the ancient Troy, going back to the movie 300 again, or some other movies. But you've often heard that's Hollywood's portrayal of the film, the Hollywood's portrayal of the historical event. And what does that mean? That means that it's not exactly based in reality. As a historian, oftentimes people say, oh, what do you think of that movie? Is that historically accurate? Well, no, that's not the point of Hollywood oftentimes. The main point, if you look under it, is certain values, right? It's what we've been talking about in this class. But the emotional appeal to something else, not the actual historical event. That's just the surface level of what they're trying to say. Underneath all that is certain values, right? Certain values that the movie makers is trying to tell the audience. That's the point. And they're trying to use some historical event to talk about that. Look at the movie Kingdom of Heaven that came out about 10 years ago. That movie came out shortly after 9/11. It's not to do with the Crusades in the Middle Ages. It's to do with American culture after 9/11 through this guise of a medieval movie. We'll talk about that in our last week of class. But that sort of thing plays out in war movies, and it has since the first one in late 1800s, 1898, to movies coming out today in the theater. As you can probably see. Look at some trailers of movies coming out, and you will see how much the value system plays a central role in the movie maker's motivation of making the film.
Okay, so I just want to spend a couple minutes to talk just about some context for the reading, some important things to illuminate for the next 2 weeks that to get out of how to look at wartime Hollywood, wars in film. Not only historically, as we're really focusing on World War II, but to take this information to film, to even video games, to ways that we portray, look at war in our culture today. Okay, so first and foremost, we're going to look at how much war is a paradox and just kind of bring up some ideas of how war contradicts itself maybe, but in doing so really illuminates the complexity of human nature. And that's what makes it so wonderful in literature and so wonderful as a medium for film. But also we're going to talk about how there's this interesting relationship that has developed specifically in World War II, but well before that, and perhaps arguably even until today, that shows this complex relationship between Hollywood and filmmakers and the United States government and the military and specific parts of the military within World War II that had a direct impact and communication with films being developed. Looking at what the audience will get out of the film, like we've been talking about in this class, but using it as a strategic part of the war effort. And I think that's really interesting and an important thing. And that's going to lead us into our third thing. That's how to put this in context and looking at our movie that we're going to see next week, Casablanca. So just 3 things: how much war is a paradox, how that's been used in film, how films coming out in World War II had a close relationship with the war itself, and then we're going to move into Casablanca. So to begin, really it's important to see how much war brings out, as you well know, the best in people, but also, as you probably know all too well, that it also brings out the absolute worst in people, brings out an ugly side of human nature sometimes, as you see on the news, in film, in stories and so forth. And it's been documented throughout the history, as we know, but film really illuminates that. And illuminates 3 parts that I think are important when looking at war being a kind of a contradiction of itself and sort of showing different aspects of human story. This is where it comes into play for our class. And you could probably think of even more categories of how war is a paradox. But just three things that I think are important to talk about in context of this class and when looking at film is how war oftentimes encourages soldiers and civilians somehow to dehumanize and to demonize their enemies. Think of ways that that has been done to dehumanize and to demonize enemies, and why that is done. Um, Perhaps it is done as a way to make it more palatable and easier to eliminate the enemy, to have such horrific aspects in war be justified. To dehumanize and to demonize them makes it much more easier to do so. But why? What is really interesting about this is that on one side, perhaps society is demonizing and dehumanizing and showing the enemy as monstrous in many cases. There's another aspect too, where there's lots of stories and instances in history where warriors on opposing sides of conflict, being faced of similar situations, with intimate conditions together and the similar being away from home and being in the trenches and being in this combat, being in the desert, where they have this sort of sense of camaraderie, the sense of brothers in arms with conflict with their enemy, and being more connected to their enemies sometimes than people back home. A famous historical event of this is in the Christmas exchange in France in 1914 during the middle of World War One, right in the thick of horrible conditions in the trenches, trench warfare, absolutely horrific. But here come soldiers on both sides out of the trenches, singing songs, Christmas songs together in different languages, playing a game of football or soccer, exchanging gifts, and sort of even telling stories of their missed loved ones back home, and having this bond, understanding of this time of war, having a connection with each other, even though they're enemies, and then knowing they're going to the very next day go back into the trenches and kill each other once again. But that's an interesting sort of uh, two sides of both coins, right? Of a coin. We have the dehumanizing and demonizing on one side, and then this effect that happens sometimes where you have this respect of understanding the enemy. And think of times you see that in movies. Yeah. Also, so there's a third part too, where war perhaps dehumanizes and shows sort of an ugly side of human nature, and shows all these things. But you see in movies time and time again, you see in literature and you see in stories, and you perhaps even know veterans yourself or know people who have been in conflict. And there's another interesting thing that tends to happen where war and recent memory depicts an idea that strips away other superficial concerns, strips away everything that's not important, and focuses in on very spiritual element as well. Think of how many movies, even in the last couple years, and people's stories coming back from war, um, perhaps being even closer in the religion, and trying to really focus on a higher power, perhaps focusing on God, and focusing somehow on concerns that the conditions and the horrific nature of war was able to strip away and bring them to. Uh, Most recently that I could think of, I mean, and there's even other movies, but in the movie Fury that came out a couple years ago with Brad Pitt, and the tank warfare of World War II, um, throughout that whole movie, you see sort of the element of a person. And the idea of Christianity in there, where he at the very end of the movie he starts quoting scripture, and everyone sort of is in silent and in awe, and there's this sense of peace. It's very interesting in a blockbuster film to see something like that, but it shows that stripping away of the superficial concerns and the need to find a higher being, whatever they may be. And you see it in the Christian element. Of course, you see it in other religions as well. But that's another interesting area as showing war as a paradox. Something to think about.
Now, if you remember from a couple weeks ago, if you saw the lecture, I mentioned the word zeitgeist. Remember that? The spirit of the age. And war movies are wonderful examples of how there is a spirit of the age when the movie's taken place, when the movie's out to the audiences. What's the spirit of the age? Look at some remakes of war movies, for example, from the 40s and 50s that are redone in the 90s and then the 21st century. And the story might be the same, but there's something that's different underneath. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe you see some remakes of movies and you could see a change. Well, that change is the sudden changes and the differences in the spirit of the age. The value system changes. You can see the clothing changes. But the war movies are a great example to be able to hone in on what the spirit of the age, what the values, what's going on in that time period that the movie's coming out. As we'll see next week with Casablanca, you see a very clear spirit of the age in that movie that's coming out right in the middle of World War II with a specific purpose, and the spirit of the age shines through very, very clearly. So start using that word, zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, to explain what's going underneath the surface of this movie. Another great movie that when you're done with this lecture, I really recommend checking out the link that I have posted in this module of Charlie Chaplin's first time speaking, well, not first time speaking in the audience, but one of the first times speaking in the audience, and surely one of the most remembered movie of Charlie Chaplin when he does speak. He tells the audience so much in his silent films, but as we see in his speech in The Great Dictator, it's been posted around Facebook. You might have already seen it, but he has so much to say as well. It is recorded as one of the best speeches of all time. It's a fascinating movie. Charlie Chaplin plays a man who's both Jewish but also looks just like this great dictator, and you will know exactly who he's making fun of in this film and sort of satirizing. But this movie came out in 1940, right in the middle of World War II, before the U.S. came into the war. The U.S. didn't come in until after Pearl Harbor in 1941, but the war was raging in Europe. And this movie is to the audiences of Europe. This is to the audiences of the U.S. seeing and aiding in and understanding what's going on in this world as Hitler's raging across Europe. And it has a lot to say to the audience of its time. But surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, but it might be shocking, and it certainly is when I see it on Facebook with people who are saying that's an amazing movie, has so much to say about our audience today. And that's the amazing thing, that it's a speech that certainly talks to the 21st century as well. So when you're done looking at this lecture, go ahead and put it on pause and check out that speech of Charlie Chaplin, who plays a Jewish war-torn person in the middle of this war, obviously World War II in Germany. They call it something else, but he escapes a concentration camp. His girlfriend's still in the camp, but he escapes, and of course the audiences or the masses are just getting ready to this big speech where the dictator is going to give this wonderful, huge speech as Hitler did, and they mistaken him for the dictator. They mistaken this Jewish escapee from a concentration camp as Hitler, and he's in this uniform, and they put him on stage to give this speech to the whole Reich, or to the whole nation under the whole empire under this dictator, and he says his speech. He's also talking in the movie. He's talking to his girlfriend who's in the concentration camp, not to lose hope. But who's he really talking to? He's talking to the audience, and he's telling them, this time of bombing across Europe, uncertainty in the world, he has a lot to say. So that's another use of war movie in its time and place, and how the audience then and the audience now get something different out of it, maybe. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed. The next day, Wake Island, with its 1st Marine Corps Defense Battalion of 450 men and about 68 Navy personnel and 1,200 civilian workers and 45 Pan Am workers from the airline that ran a Clipper plane off the island to the United States, were stuck on the island as it was being raided and bombed and ready to be completely surrounded by Japanese forces. The Mexican War had the slogan, "Remember the Alamo." Spanish Americans had "Remember the Maine." World War I had "Remember the Lusitania," the submarine that sank. World War II newspapers needed something similar to grasp the American public. Pearl Harbor happened, but the very next day when Wake Island was bombed, Hollywood and the media jumped on that. Because here was this island not only being bombed, but being surrounded by Japanese forces. They were stuck on the island, and perfect opportunity to start using this as the battle cry of this new war. The people on Wake Island, not only the soldiers but the civilians and everybody else, were stuck there from December 10th through December 23rd. And there's letters back and forth. The Pan Am flights were still able to go, but the soldiers instead, they held fast. The small amount of people on the island killed over 700 Japanese, including 4 destroyers. But at the end, it was a defeat. But it was a lot like the Alamo. It was a lot like the sinking of Lusitania. And Hollywood was right there to make it. As the people were on the island, Hollywood was in its development stages to make it into a movie. As it was actually going on, as the battle was raging, as the bombing was happening on the island, Hollywood was back in California working with not only the War Department, but also getting things together to start filming. They were using the letters. They had access to the letters from the commander, and they were putting that into this film. So it's more than just newspapers and headlines. Hollywood was making a movie as the event was going on to show the American public this is what they're doing. This is what's happening in this war as we speak. It's a very clear message. So Paramount Studios started work on this big blockbuster movie, Wake Island, as the war itself, as the battle itself was being waged out. It's a form of propaganda. And propaganda it's not a bad word, especially in World War II. Propaganda is a big part conducted in the war effort in World War II in connection with Hollywood, with the military, OSS. If you've seen the movie Inglourious Bastards, that came out by Quentin Tarantino, he talks about the OSS, and those characters in there are real, kind of based on real people, of course. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, it's the precursor to the CIA, had over 24,000 people working in the offices in a variety of different ways. One man in particular, a Navy commander and part of the OSS, as well as a director, John Ford. You might remember him if you're a fan of Westerns and some of the early war movies. Well, he was a direct part of this connection of Hollywood with the war effort, with the military. And he was a commander in the Navy. He was, at the same time as he's commanding people on the ships, he was also making movies. Now, behind this whole war effort, but connection between Hollywood and the military, is the OWI, the Office of War Information. That is part of the OSS that's using strategic ways to use propaganda to get the American people to be behind the effort 100%. They need the American public in every vector, every part of the country to be in support of what's going on overseas, not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific. There's a big fear that the Japanese can land at any time. There's a big fear that German forces could wipe out Europe and eventually come across to the United States. That fear was real. And so Hollywood had a very important role to uphold certain values, to uphold certain standards, to uphold the way the American people needs to engage in what's going on. The director of OWI, Elmer Davis, said the easiest way to inject a propaganda idea into the minds of the people is to let it go through the medium of an entertainment picture when they don't realize they are being propagandized. So the very idea of the director of OWI, working with Hollywood, working with the military, working with the President of the United States. President Roosevelt's right in the thick of all this, as you will see in the reading, is to how to get message across by not saying it through news, not saying it through a political person like the president, but through entertainment. And that was a very strategic, important part of World War II. Now, there's one movie in particular that characterizes this whole theme that we're talking about, where Hollywood is in connection with the military, is in connection with OWI, Office of War Information, in connection and in communication with the president himself, President Roosevelt, in the middle of World War II, and the White House, and having direct dealings with filming every day. In fact, there's a person from the White House, there's a person from the OWI on set while they're filming. The OWI states that this is a very good picture about the enemy, whose lives the enemy has wrecked and whose underground agents are fighting unremittingly in their own ground. They say, the report continues to say, the film portrays evil, arrogant Nazis, a disregard to human life and dignity that the Nazis do. They create chaos and misery throughout Europe, and the film demonstrates the spirit of the underground movement. Of course, the movie the OWI is talking about that puts a lot of effort to, they put a lot of resources, they put financial money behind the making of this movie because they see the importance to the audience for this reason of connecting them to what's going on in the war, to bring the nation together. And that, of course, is Casablanca. Casablanca is the quintessential war movie. It might not have bombing every 5 minutes and have soldiers on the front, but it is a war movie, and it is created by the War Office as a war effort as the battle's raging on.
Play it, Sam. You must remember this. A kiss is just a kiss. A sigh is just a sigh. The fundamental things
You can't get away.
Rick, hide me. Do something. You must help me, Rick.
I'd stick my neck out for nobody.
Wise foreign policy. And when two lovers woo, they still say I love you. On that you
Why did you come back? To tell me why you ran out on me at the railway station?
Yes.
no
You can tell me now. I'm reasonably sober.
brings as time goes.
There is a man arrived in Casablanca on his way to America. He will offer a fortune to anyone who furnish him with an exit visa.
What's his name?
Victor Laszlo.
Can deny. It's still the same.
It's perhaps a strange circumstance.
A fight
We both
for
should be in love with the same woman.
A case of do or die. The world will always welcome lovers as time goes by.
He's looking at you, kid.